Let's see. Hey, folks, I'm Layman Pascal, recording this in the distant past. I'm assuming you just dug up this digital artifact after having discovered our secret integral stage archive buried deep beneath the radioactive desert that used to be the United States. We've placed into this time capsule everything we think you will need to reboot civilization. Instructions for building water purification systems, clean energy production, protocols for accelerated intersubjectivity and new culture production, several texts on integral post-metaphysical spirituality, 3 large vats of ayahuasca, the completely preserved skeleton of our mascot Jedediah the non-dual mule, and this following discussion with Aviv Shahar about the Homo Universalis Project that he's been conducting with Karen Henney and Kyriaki Nicandrou. Aviv is the host of the Portals of Perception podcast. He's a keen, motivated, and sensitive interlocutor who feels into topics as well as exploring them intellectually. I think he's an excellent friend to the unfolding leading edge, transformational, developmental, and regenerative communities, and I'm always happy to talk with him. Hi, Aviv.
Good to be with you, Layman. Thank you for this illustrious opening.
So, who are you and how have you arrived here?
Yeah, I am. How do you answer a question like this? I am a human being on planet Earth in a time of profound epochal change that I believe is heralding the onsetting of the next 1,000 years of a new human model we are calling the Universalis human. I am a husband and father and grandfather. I am a consultant to some of the senior teams in some of the largest companies in the world. And I have lived a mystical and esoteric life undercover for many decades and started to share more of that when the Portals Project came into light, which was launched early in the pandemic. And it was motivated and inspired because on October of 2019, my granddaughter was born. I looked into her eyes when she was 3 weeks old, and that experience and that feeling told me I'm going to dedicate the rest of my planetary journey to do whatever I can humanly do to live a better, brighter future for her and now for her brother, younger than her. So it's been an exciting ride. Born and raised in Israel, trained as a fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force. And we can talk about anything else you like to talk in between as it serves the conversation. So how about that as an opening?
That's a great opening. Thinking toward this conversation, I was pondering sort of the general sense people might have about the universal human being. Seems to me that people in general might have a couple of different notions, right? I think everybody's familiar with a generalist or kind of like a universalist as opposed to a specialist. I think some people are familiar with some old esoteric ideas like Adam Kadmon, or sort of like the grand human being who somehow embodies and reflects the multidimensional sacred realm. And a lot of people are probably familiar with science fiction scenarios where human explorers keep running into human beings or human being-like species scattered through the cosmos and are forced to think that there may be some cosmic framing to the human. I think everybody could sort of sense into those 3 versions of a universal human, but what's your version of a universal human? What do those words signify for you? Then how do they start to become this project that you've been working on?
Yeah, very good question. I would ask the listener and people joining us to just forget all those reference points you mentioned and to create an open canvas to bring a new impression. I'm getting something on my glasses, so I'll pick up my glasses in a minute if we choose to bring some slides where I've actually tried to pull together a landscape for you. But where would I begin this? I'd actually go to something other than a framing comment, but more to an intuitive feeling sense, which is that so I came of age still in the 20th century into the 70s and the 80s. I'm a little older than I look. That's what the lifeguards in the beach nearby here tell me. And I remember coming into my consciousness of youth at the time of the Cold War. And there was always an intuition that this one day will be over and that humanity will then look to leap forward into something else. And my intuition earlier on very much centered on this idea of the new human that will one day arise here. Now, it's possible that partly it was my translation and my assimilation of having been born and raised in an idealistic environment. You got to consider my formative childhood, born and raised in a kibbutz in Israel. My father and many people of his generation are the people that escaped the Second World War in Europe. And he came from very religious Hasidic background, but is part of that population that in the face of the horror of the Holocaust said, we don't want to do anything. I don't want to consider anything to do with it, because where was God when we most needed God? So what do? They turn their back on the Hasidic religious background. They become Zionists, and in some way they transform the spiritual, religious, formative experience of their childhood into some kind of an idealistic formation of the kibbutz movement, which is still today, I believe, the most fascinating communal endeavor of the last several centuries. In all the conversations that you and others have had about game B experiments, communal experiments, I don't know why there's never been a discussion, why I've never been invited to describe, well, what are the learnings from the kibbutz? What were its success thresholds and where it failed? And what is that teaching us about communal endeavor? But all that is background to describing that I am experiencing my upbringing in that social environment, tremendous amount outdoors in nature, having some, I didn't have that language at the time, but experiencing some of what I will later, in retrospective view, will realize were initiatory experiences, a touch of the beyond and a touch of the ineffable, with phenomenology that I had no language for and no grasp and no understanding for. And somewhere towards the end of high school, the education environment was very different. It was the kibbutz education at that time was somewhat influenced by the world of education, although I didn't know anything about world of education shaped by Rudolf Steiner, but it had some of that approach, which meant it was pretty free to tailor around themes. And I persuaded the high school principal and the teachers that I didn't need to sit in the classroom for the last 18 months of high school, and I just sat on my own in the library and grabbed anything I could find in the philosophical and other spaces. There wasn't as much as there is today. There wasn't anything integral at the time that I became aware of. But there was tremendous amount of something else, and more importantly, I was experiencing something that I didn't actually find any exterior translation, any language that would match that experience. So there was a phenomenology and interior sense that was to do with the future, was to do with humanity was going to go through some kind of a transformation, critical transformation. And it was in the zeitgeist in some ways in the broader West in the 70s. And the year I'm talking about, high school, is 76, to just locate the timeline. But I sensed that there was something beyond that. And I wrote my high school dissertation. And one thing I remember from that time is my classroom friends, when we came to do the show of the end of school to all that there was going to be some, I don't know, 700-800 people gathered in all the communities, kibbutz communities that were involved. And it was customary that somebody would give a certain speech, and they said, you should give a speech. And I said, well, you know what that means? I'm going to write whatever I want to write, and I'm going to say whatever I want to say, and nobody's going to have any thing to say about that. And I remember myself at age 16 and a half, because I graduated rather early, and standing on stage and giving a speech about the new human that was going to emerge in the future. Now, the content, the framework was secondary and made sense in some way, but in other ways, obviously, it was not developed and not evolved at all. You could say I had no idea what I was talking about. Really, no idea what I was talking about. There was more an intuition, a feeling sense, a sense of being called to something. I then, years later, came to realize that there were many people who came into their consciousness in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, whom I have begun to describe as agents from the future, sleeping agents from the future, placed on Earth to be awakened by some clarion call, who will at some point, that will at some point be sound, so would be heard. So that's a bit of a feeling, intuition sense rather than the frame of reference, which is, as you know from our earlier conversations, is my way of beginning to quote into the conversation more than just a mental faculty, but the intuition, the instincts in people about what is this time we are in right now, why there is so much confusion and seemingly chaos in the world. Why does it appear to be as though the modern framework, the modern experiment that we've been in, well, in one way for 400 years, in another way for the last 150, 200 years in the modern economy, and more overtly after the Second World War in the various global arrangements, why is it all falling apart? And what might we be called? What are we called to do in response to that, wherever we find ourselves in small and large ways? So rather than answer what is the Universalis idea and why I actually anchor this idea around the word Universalis and the universal human, I give it more that background, and if it's helpful, I can at some point bring a slide and run through what I propose would be in the landscape of the conversation.
Feels like there could be many parallels between our life stories, and there definitely should be some recorded discussions that take the kibbutz experiment more seriously. I certainly remember the people of my parents' generation, all of the interesting ones had gone or considered going over. I think when I introduced those three topics to bridge into this conversation, Yes, I was poking around at what's in the general mind, but I think I wasn't looking so much at frameworks as a couple of specific qualities that I think are involved here. I think transdisciplinarity is involved here. Um, I think a cosmic theme or cosmic attunement, which also goes along with futuristic attunement, is involved. But also this question about uh, ancient visions, or maybe ancient instances of the same kind of feeling that you came across that go back very deeply into the world of our ancestors. And before we go into looking at a slide, which I'd like to do to get a sense of this landscape you're discussing, I'd just like to know how you in general relate to this, to the possibility of how our current sense of what the future new human could be relates to what we imagine our ancestors, the best of our ancestors, let's say, might also have felt the future human could be. Do you see parallels between the archaic and the futuristic?
Well, so the brief answer is yes to everything you said there. Yes to the interdisciplinary approach or the metadisciplinary approach. Yes to the cosmic sense, and yes to the futuristic sense. And also yes to the bridging, which you will see is on the way I will paint the landscape. Because for me, the Universalis story is inseparable from the epochal story. And so when we tell the story of the epoch, we by definition bring the ancestral dimension to it, both the near term ancestral. By near term, I mean more the, well, let's say 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, where we might find it easier to access. And also the further backward in time or distant ancestral in the sense of earlier in the epoch, all the way to the significance of the axial transition and what that period represented. And then where we go more esoteric, ancestral also in the sense of the ancestral epochs that preceded this epoch, in the sense of the deep history of written and not so written, of the planet and the species that we are part of. So I've always held the intuition, the feeling sense that we are we are here merely in a relay experience, relay experiment, and to the best of our ability, we are meant to catch the baton of the frontier of the people that came before us. And we're supposed to be good ancestors to I think the word is forecestors that will follow us if we can pass the baton to them. And that actually shaped very much my youth, that consideration, because for several years I experienced the turmoil. I think when I was awakened to adult awareness, 1973, at the time of the Yom Kippur War, because all the adults were called to the army to fight on the northern and southern frontiers that collapsed. So all of a sudden, we were, at the 14-year-old, I had something important to do all of a sudden. I needed to take care of the agriculture of the kibbutz. And it would sound strange, but the next few weeks proceeded to be some of the most exhilarating experiences of my formative years, because we had a unique contribution to make. But after that, I felt there was a long time of sense of bewilderment, because I looked at my parents' generation and they just did something colossal. They established the state of Israel. And the parallel would be in the West, so in Canadian and the American called the greatest generation or the great generation because and in Europe, because they rebuild Europe. And my anxiety when I was 14, 15 was, well, what's left for us to do? What will we do? And I lived into that inquiry for several years. And into my 20s, I started to get a clearer sense that it was to do with the transition of the epoch, with the evolution that was to accelerate. Initially, I thought towards the end of the 20th century. I wasn't the only one to make that mistake, that there was going to be a quick bypassing of all that we have gone through over the last 2-3 decades. I think that was partly built into the development that was not attended to. This is where integral frameworks are helpful in understanding some of that. And so that means that there are deep roots for me in both the ancestral appreciation and also in the feeling intuition. And if you like, the Universalis Project is fermenting and building in me for decades before I even have the language of it, before I understand anything about it. It's more a feeling sense that this just doesn't make sense, that the way the world is operating, and something else will need to reveal itself. And I think the next several decades is that time of transition. And I think I'm kind of jumping to the end, and I think we are now in the early stages of the next 1,000 years of where humanity is going, in which every generation feels that there is something important for it. I feel that this time, people that are alive today, all of us, all generations, the people in the 90s and 80s and people in all through the ages, including my grandchildren, we came here to do something, to have us participate in something that's evolving. And if we are lucky, the personal journey, the search to discover why am I here in the personal sense, I mean, that the greater luck of life is always when the personal inquiry is able to merge inside a greater universal inquiry. So I'd say that there are deeper layers of appreciation to why universal. How do we mean do we mean that just this in the sense of being a universalist and it can play in different theaters and different domains? Yes, but there is so much more. So I'd say that to offer a bit of a bridging.
That's fabulous. So maybe you could see if we can share this introductory slide and get a sense of what the landscape of the Universalis vision is.
Yeah, I mean, your questions were leading perfectly into it. So we already touched a good portion of it, which I'm not surprised at all that you would lead there. You see this all right? Yeah, or it comes through as a double, or you see one slide?
I can see one slide.
Good. Okay. Sometime the projection mode goes funny. So let's talk about the Universalis landscape. And then you can play jazz with whatever you feel you want to double click here. So I'd say we need to bring into the conversation the understanding of an epoch. What is an epoch? And what is its function? And how does it work? How does an epoch actually work? The placeholder definition I'll offer to it, which already will introduce some contrarian thinking for which we will need to bring other dimensions, is that consider an epoch as a development program. The moment you say development program, you say, okay, so where is the development program coming from, and who is issuing or generating the program for who, and what do we mean by that? And within that, we need to ask what was the development and evolutionary purpose of the epoch that's ending inside the context of successive epochs. And so why would we call this, specifically in the context of now, a universalis transition? So I'd offer that as one area to explore. Perhaps before we even go there, it would be useful to bring to life, since you wrote the book about Gurdjieff, it might be useful to bring to life the threefold perspective, the exoteric, mesoteric, esoteric, such that we bring this framing, this threefold activation into the conversation about the epoch. And that as we do so, we bring also the correspondence principle and the reversal dynamics, the placeholder appreciation for that. Is the correspondence principle is sometimes described as the as above, so below idea. The man is made in the image of God. Now, the reversal dynamics is an important nuance within the correspondence principle, which is right, as above, so below, but not always in the literal sense, because sometimes there will have to be a reversal dynamics, that reversal configuration in order to allow the transition through octaves. So I just said a few words here that we may want to double click and open and further with another slide if we choose to or not. So that would be the second large space. The third large space, since we are talking we are doing this conversation on the integral stage, what's the conversation without identifying that on the upper right, we will bring the sevenfold epoch dynamics, because for me, the sevenfold epoch dynamics is not merely a map and not a subjective articulation, but actually an objective way of seeing the world, simply because even exactly at this time yesterday when I was swimming in the ocean, I looked up and there was this beautiful rainbow in the sky, clouds and beautiful rainbow. So there is something in the physics, in the astrophysics, if you like, of the sunlight and the planetary ecology, where the emergence of these two dynamics, two entities, which when we begin to sense into them in a deeper, more esoteric way, we no longer see them as just merely two physical objects floating in space, but rather as spheres of living processes that interpenetrate each other. When they interpenetrate each other, they produce a beautiful rainbow, which is codified in the Bible in the language of the ancients as a covenant arrangement, a covenantal configuration. Why is that? What does it mean? How could we take this ancient idea, biblical idea, and bring it through the lens of scientific inquiry and integration, but then also take it to beyond the limitation that sometimes physicalist science will impose on us? So all that would be in the upper right. In the lower right, we would tell the stories of the rise and fall of civilization and how they are the background for some of the some of the human development, human evolution throughout the ages, and why we propose that we have entered the time of the initiation of the Universalis human, and what was before that. Well, if we are to just tease the appetite of people to stay here with us for the latter part of the conversations, if we're not talking about a Universalis human, well, what was before that? could there have been a Solaris human, and could there have been a planetus human? Just if you want to use these words. So, and then in the lower left, we're looking to appreciate truly the interior formation and evolution of the human through the ages. We will ask about the significance of the axial transition and the Enlightenment, and then inquire about the experiential, the phenomenology nature of the epochal shift throughout the ages and through to today. What is it that we are experiencing differentially, and why this is important that we are reflective of in terms of when we look to metabolize knowledge and metabolize what we are sensing in these frontiers that we are exploring. And since several months ago, last year, we recorded the inquiry around the fifth quadrant, I thought I'd be negligent if I didn't include the fifth dimension here, which is the co-emergent, co-arising property through those four spaces in the idea of the initiatory emergence of the quintessential Universalis cosmology. And then what else I will add to this topographical landscape are various conversation areas of the Universalis arising, the capacities that are coming online. We touched some of that in our various earlier conversations, but it would be a whole conversation by itself if we want to just stay with this space within the Universalis context. There is right next to it the sense organs and the sense-making organs that are engaged when we bring these inquiries to the table. The significance of mutualized and communal emergence. Why is it so critical that we have these conversations and explorations inside the context of the gathering of humans? What is it about our coming together at this time? How is our togethering today in the Universalis context different from earlier in the epoch tribal configurations? So all that will be a very important space to reflect on. And in the context of that, so what are the philosophies and what are the theologies that, if we are proposing that we have entered some kind of not just a new phase of enlightenment, but potentially a transition that's larger than that, and if anything is analogous to the axial transition and perhaps even potentially is larger than that, then what are some of the nascent philosophies and theologies that we can identify that would be emergent in that, and what, therefore, the ecologies of living practices that are central to this transition? We've explored some of these in various conversations. I've asked you, every time we have spoken, I've asked you about the practical and the praxis and the practices dimension, because I believe we are going through an initiatory phase, and it's an evolutionary phase in which we are co-arising conscious participants, which is what makes it so unique. And so we have to identify how do we play our part, and it's not the only way, but one of the ways we play our part is by the daily embodied and souled spiritualized practices that we bring to the table. And finally, there is an important conversation to have about the perils of all of that I'm describing, and about the perils and the fallacies of this transitional phase, and what is it we must confront and disarm and disabuse ourselves of, and how do we approach this in a way that is ready to integrate what we have never been able to integrate before, including our various blind spots. So all that would be part of the landscape. So I suggest we probably have here more than we could get to in one conversation, but we could nevertheless do a robust starter into this. My suggestion
Yes.
is we ought to start with a little more about the threefold perspective, but please guide this wherever you'd want to go.
Well, I think the threefold perspective will show up in every aspect of this we talk about. Um, I think partly because epoch came first, I'd like to focus there a little bit because it's a very open question how we think about there being epochs. I think a lot of us have this deeply felt sense of world shifts, large historical periods. This seems to be broadly shared among human cultures today and anciently. But where we draw the lines as to what counts as an epoch, how we think about the causality, right? Many people think about a technological change occurs, and then using the technology changes our brain, and then that changes our culture. Other people think in terms of arising new ideas and philosophies and cognitive capacities. In integral models, we try to say that those are both true and complementary. There are esoteric ideas that things happening in the cosmos hold sway over long periods of human history, that we move into the age of Horus or the age of Aquarius, these sorts of notions. So I guess to set this up, um, how are you, what are the epochs you're thinking of? And why should we consider that there really are epochs as opposed to just every human generation imagining some kind of simplified chunking of its own history?
Yeah, well, the consideration of the epoch itself is by itself, you could say, an esoteric framing, which is why it would be useful to actually bring into it already the threefold perspective. But it at an intuitive sense, felt, registered, experienced angle, I would simply say that I never believed that we were flying on a random scientific experiment that is purely physicalist and material, and that right there, the consideration of an epoch would enter the picture, because the very nature of human development, most people are grappling with the day-to-day nature of, getting through the struggles of the day and the crises of life. But if and when you've been, and there is nothing to be dismissed about that is a huge, big part of the human experience. My inquiry from earlier on in life involved the sense that we were living into a time of transition. And as I described earlier, I didn't understand it for many, many years, and I only partly understand it now, but it felt to be beyond technological. So the technological and the generational will be indeed, Layman, the exoteric view of the epoch. If we left it purely as a technological or socioeconomic, then that would be the exoteric study of epochs. The mesoteric study of the epoch will involve deeper realizations, because we will be inquiring about, so what is it that fundamentally shifted about human life in a deeper way from the axial time, from times where people lived in feudal societies, where one entity held all the powers. The king was the economic power, the religious power, and the social power. Before the innovation of the separation of powers entered the scene, truly inspired by the ethics and the morality of the Enlightenment, but more coming into the foreground in the 18th, 19th century as the liberal democratic experiment is arising throughout the world, mostly in the West, but throughout the world. So the mesoteric inquiry will look at the epoch and say, well, okay, so the socioeconomic and the which is the visible social arrangement and the technological, would these be sufficient to describe the epochal shift, or are there deeper dimensions? And ultimately, you then would have to inquire into the esoteric dimensions of why we can tell a human evolutionary story in successive epochs. What is it about? And how is it shaping this moment in time? What is this epochal moment all about? So I'd start there as an entry into that.
What that brings up for me is a sense of how the esoteric, mesoteric, and exoteric dimensions have to work together in certain ways to allow the healthy unfolding process to move through these epochs. And that resembles a kind of growth and maturational process in the individual, even though we don't want to make too strong a correlation between historical phases and phases of individual growth. But when you look at individual growth, there can be many kinds of disruptions to an individual's maturation. They don't get enough of what they need, or trauma interferes, or any number of things can go on like that. And I'm curious how you think about the disruption of the relationship between these three levels, because one of the patterns we seem to see throughout history is that social conflagrations, whether they're wars or civil wars or revolutions, very often destroy a lot of the esoteric inheritance that was already built up by our ancestors. Right, so there are these many breaks in that transmission lineage. I remember seeing, when I was a boy, the footage of the Taliban destroying the Buddha statues in the desert. It was a very shocking thing to see, and it was almost like they had an instinct to start wrecking the esoteric inheritance. And we know that many of the works of Greek philosophy were lost, that the great libraries were burned, that often there is even the murder and destruction of the esoteric temples in various cultures. What effect do you think the exoteric disruption of the esoteric transmission has on the way that these epochs unfold?
So you asked three questions, and you asked about first these three perspectives, and I think for the usefulness or for to give us more tools to play with, I'd like to do a threefold esoteric, mesoteric, exoteric 101 in a minute. And then I can approach the two other questions you asked. One in which you're looking at the developmental stages in the individual case, and how we sometimes go up and down. I describe it as travel up and down the timeline of the developmental line. And there is an interesting play there about, so what is the time factor within development, and how and where are they convergent or not, and how the individual experience is matching the collective large-scale cultural epochal experience, and the placeholders seeding for that would be to say that obviously we are right now in the middle of what can be described in the culture as a regressive cycle. Now, I need to place this in context. What is a regressive cycle? But when I do, I will suggest that you can place one next to the other as parallel phenomena, the phenomenology of being triggered and traveling down, being called to contract down your developmental line, and the culture experiencing that. It's not exactly the same in the interior anatomy, but there are parallels in terms of the phenomenology. And then I can circle back to the last question which you asked was, so what would we offer by way of commentary about the destruction of esoteric artifacts and lineage and even sacred temples, such that they were destroyed from physical access and perhaps are more left for mystical or astral or akashic access for those that believe in the capacity to access these in this way. So let me try and do I had to work your inquiry in this order. So here is what I propose as a way to appreciate the three levels of knowledge. At the exoteric level, the exoteric appreciation of exoteric is that exoteric is information. That the mesoteric is knowledge, or where the information is going through some reformation. And the exoteric view of esoteric is that this is where transformation occurs. So notice in this case, I simply have the name, what I call the referential knowledge. I can name something. I'm pausing there for a minute because we live through an age where there is an extraordinary proliferation of referential knowledge. That is to say, people believe that when they can name something, it means they already know it in the fuller sense. They do in the exoteric sense, but not necessarily in the mesoteric or the esoteric sense. If I am to try to then name a mesoteric appreciation, well, the mesoteric view of exoteric is this is where it explores expansive data sources. And the mesoteric is where we truly begin to organize, to categorize, to order some hierarchy for the knowledge. Not all knowledge lives at the same level. Controversial idea in a postmodern age, as you know, but it is actually part of the mesoteric realization. No, not all knowledge would exist at the same level, which means would not have the same power. But power is only a consideration that would enter truly the esoteric, because it's in the esoteric where we say we begin to engage a source that opens truly new perceptions and leading us to a point where I'm describing that there is a reversal. In a minute, I'll instantiate why there is a reversal, where the esoteric way of viewing exoteric this is where we metabolize the vast reference fields of life. So anybody that pretend to only live esoteric life in some monastic, reclusive way, okay, fair enough. But even then, you have to actually metabolize the planetary reference fields of all the various domains if you're going to be able to nourish and offer the kind of nutriment that your esoteric inquiry requires. And part of that nourishment will come from recognizing that you will choose to go deeply on certain mesoteric domains because they both serve as nourishment. They also are, in the energetic sense, they perform a function. They are the domains and the enclosures that contain and support the esoteric core, where the esoteric inquiry is about actually liberating the originating initiatory core and its communion and its transmission potential. So now this is all what I did now. I went through exoteric, mesoteric, esoteric, but this run is largely exoteric because I only name those. To give it some life, I need to give 1 or 2 or 3 examples to bring it to life. Let's take the word love. When you say, I love chocolate ice cream, and somebody says, well, I love the strawberry ice cream, you're using the word love at an exoteric context. It's something you like to consume. So then you say, well, but what would be love at a mesoteric level? And then you begin to explore the deeper feelings, the registration of love, and it will lead you to this sense of being with things you love to be with and spend time with, and possibly when you lose the sense of time. That's a deeper appreciation of love. An esoteric appreciation of love would recognize that there is a reversal. Because initially, love was to do what I feel is energizing for me, what I enjoy most. But when I became a parent, love was doing often the thing I least wanted to do. Like waking up in the middle of the night when I'm totally exhausted after I already lived 3 days in that one day. But the voice of a crying baby will wake you up in the middle of the night. So you could say, well, but this is just purely biological response. No, it's not purely biological response. There are parents who choose to keep on sleeping. But even if it is a biological response, there is an esoteric dimension to it. So there is curious, strange reversal from initially love was to do what I felt like doing. And in the esoteric dimension, love would be sometimes the sense that I must do, the thing I least want to do. That would be a whole other way of appreciating love. And then there are deeper layers of love is in the sense of, okay, so why is the word love the prefix of the word evolution and evolve, just in reverse? Is there any esoteric hint for us about the evolutionary impulse as something that comes out of the love of life for itself, but to recognize that it needs to go through some kind of a reversal, because in most life forms, we see that the evolutionary process occurs through cycles of death and rebirth. So what is it that is in this process? I'm just seeding the way of sensing the reversal that occur. Let me try and describe a second example. Let's take the word work. At the exoteric level, work is the job you get because it'll pay you what you need to be able to pay the rent. That as much as you'd think about work. At the mesoteric level, you bring engineering and design thinking to work. There was a time when I was looking to push the envelope of my consulting practice for 2 reasons. There was a mesoteric reason and there was an esoteric reason why I was pushing the envelope. The mesoteric reason, I wanted to accelerate the timeline to financial freedom. So I looked at some point and I said, okay, how am I going to make 20 years of revenue generation in 7? So around 2012, 2013, I wanted to complete the decade and be financially free. So I didn't know yet what I will do, but I intuited that I will need to do something else. So it led me to ask, well, so how can I truly maximize my impact? And I discovered that at certain aspects of work, what I will need to do is I will need to do the least amount of work necessary. And the inquiry I was grappling with, how many large-scale, complex corporate projects could I run? And so at first I ran one project and it was like full-time job. But I then told myself, if you're running one project, you're not really a solopreneur. It's as though you're working for that corporation. So very early on, I needed to work on two projects. So I never felt like I was working for one company. But then I said, could you actually concurrently run 3 projects, 4 projects, 5 projects? When I pushed the envelope to its limit, it reached 7 projects. And the guiding principle was, I will do the least amount of work necessary to produce the value and the impact I needed to create. And to do so, I needed to delegate a lot of the work back to the client. When it comes to the esoteric, there is a reversal. If the mesoteric scaling principle was do the least amount of work for you to deliver the differentiation that you can deliver, in the esoteric realm where, for example, I grappled with questions around, so how can you stabilize yourself as a teaching vessel? How can you make yourself truly the best human instrument that you can be, not in the personal sense, but in the sense that you can be a useful tool for knowledge to work through you and catalyze knowledge in others? And much more about that. And there I discovered that the reverse would be true. I needed to do the unnecessary work. Doing the unnecessary work involved, well, anything we will do in the space of reflecting deeply on our development, because the exigencies of life will not force you to go into reflecting on your blind spots and reflecting on why certain comment from somebody became triggering for you. Oh, I thought I already integrated and developed that. Why did I get triggered there? What was that about? Yeah, I've entered a new octave, and part of entering a new octave is it would first bring to the surface everything that you have not fully integrated. Welcome it, find a way to embrace it. So doing that work. And then if you do work in any space of healing and counseling and teaching and leading and facilitating people in a whole range of ways, I have found time and again that doing the extra unnecessary work would be a necessary principle if I am to be not perfect, but as humanly ready as I can be, in the sense of acting with integrity, bringing the integrity of having done the unnecessary work, having made the super effort, to use a term that you know so well, to make sure that when I'm at the table at the point of engagement, I've at least done anything and everything that was humanly available for me. And it never meant that I needed to be perfect, but it then afforded me the freedom to know that deep inside I'm honest with myself. Before I'm honest with any other person, can I be honest with myself? And that was partly the guiding into the reversal of do the unnecessary work. So once again, the transition from the first transition from exoteric to mesoteric was a deepening move, deepening and broadening and expanding move. The move from mesoteric to esoteric involved some kind of a reversal where we would have to almost leave behind some of the ways we have worked before. Let me just very swiftly bring into it one more less personal but very current and relevant example to instantiate the three levels. 99% of humanity are completely unaware of the way the global economy is working, Layman. They wouldn't really be able to tell you what's GDP and what are interest rates and how is all the machinations of the global financial system and what's the place of commodities and what gold has anything to do with the global financial system and the history of that. And so most people simply manage the economy more at a personal level, the paycheck to paycheck, the bank account, and the economy of getting the groceries and changing every few years the car. So the mesoteric gap is truly deeply appreciating the way the global economy is working, especially in the last several centuries when it became a truly connected global economy. So if somebody want to learn that, they will learn about the economy, they will go to work in Wall Street or one of the investment banks, and they will acquire mesoteric know-how in this space. But the second gap from mesoteric to esoteric is very different. It's one where it's not about we don't know how the global economy is working. It's the gap where it's actually a double or triple gap, which is the misunderstanding or the lack of perception of a deeper esoteric perception about what human life is. And because of and again, that may sound critical or aloof, but it's not being spoken from that place. It's being spoken from esoteric inquiry for 4 decades into what is human life, and so what are we humans doing here on this planet. And it doesn't mean that you need to have a full ready-made answers, but it means that the esoteric inquiry will look to close the gap from I understand how the economy works to I need to understand what is the values, perception gap, values gap, and purpose gap. Because we clearly see, we would then begin to see that the economy is running not by the values that invite the liberation of the greatest creative human potential to liberate what the human is here on Earth and in the universe to possibly do through all its latent capacities, but that we have, in many ways, by the global economy, been harnessed, been enrolled to be Homo economicus rather than human beings. And part of my assertion that we have entered the Universalis human, the time of the Universalis human, one of the dimensions of it, we will have to rewrite the Homo economicus and all that has occurred planetarily that brought us to this point, which is already suggesting that the exoteric view of an epoch would look at the current problems, the current impossibilities on the planetary global stage, and say, we cannot solve the problems at this level, at the level of the problems that we've created. And because of that, we would need to truly embrace a new way of seeing the world. So I am kind of beginning to go where this naturally go, but I said a lot there, and I still have to engage your other
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, before we go to the other two aspects of my question, if you can recall them, that would be fantastic. I want to take a moment to appreciate what you've laid out here because I want people seeing this or hearing this to appreciate what a contribution this is because the notion of exoteric, mesoteric, and esoteric circulates fairly broadly. People have slightly different ways of phrasing it. But what you've done is amplify two particular aspects of it with enormous clarity. And the one aspect that you've amplified is its uh, perspectival recursion, right? That there's an exoteric way of viewing the relationship between the three and a mesoteric way of viewing the relationship between the three. And just putting that forward, even though other people have had a few ideas like that, this is a really clear and powerful way to accentuate that aspect of it and to make it a much richer form of analysis. The other thing you've done here is um, really clarify this notion of the reversal. And I appreciate the examples you've used because I think they were necessary in order to get that across between a conventional relationship to any phenomenon and then a higher order conventional relationship to that phenomenon where you try to work smarter, not harder. You try to do a higher order organization of those engagements. But then the next step or the other step is not of the same kind. It does have the feeling of a reversal to a qualitative clarification and extension of the principles that you seemed like you were leaving behind in that first transition. And now you understand you have to come at them in a more subtle way and a more intentional way, but you have to reappreciate and purposefully move into the very things you thought you were moving away from as you move to that higher order reorganization of your engagements. That's a very abstract way to say what you laid out in some nice personal examples, but I hope everyone who's watching really appreciates the two moves that you've made in doing this. I think it's a wonderful contribution.
Well, so let's see if we can be courageous enough and daring enough to take one more example to thread into the other spaces we want to go into, and there is always a risk in going where I'm about to go, but there is also a risk in not doing and not following what you are called to say and speak and describe. So part of what I will describe, if whether we get to this slide or not, I can speak to that now. Part of the way I'll describe the epoch perspective at this moment in time is very much in the context of, say, the last 60 years and the culmination of the modernity project at this time, including what I just alluded to, the fact that why do we need a universalis human? Because we need a human that can indeed integrate and assimilate multi-perspectival way, which is why when we describe the developmental history of the 20th century, we will see that all that has emerged that led us into multi-perspectival capacities, in many ways, I believe, is a heraldry of what we are describing with the universalis human. It's one of the capacities, one of the core capacities that have come online, is coming online, continuing to evolve. And I believe we are now at a point that we need to integrate and embrace additional perspectives that we have so far struggled to embrace, which is why I started to serialize the beginning of this year, a body of work which I call portals, we call portals into the soul, where part of the endeavor is to reintegrate the soul. Now, if you bring the word soul in many conversational arenas, especially those that want to maintain credibility with the scientific community, at the extreme end, you'll be laughed out of the room because you'd be told you can't actually show me under a microscope that there is a soul. So what is it you're talking about? At the second category, it will be represented as a poetic idea, something we will use in the arts or in writing poetry. In the third category, we will perhaps embrace it more as the sense of the self, but I will still insist that there is more to it. And if I'm still in a scientific conversation, semi-scientific or scientifically inclined conversation, somebody will say, okay, so you probably mean when you talk about the property of the soul or the property of consciousness, and they will describe the current big picture story that is the way science found a way to smuggle a physicalist, materialist view into the discussion of consciousness and the soul, where the story that's being told is that we are seeing the phenomenology of the complexification of the universe and more complex atomic and molecular structures coming together, giving birth to life, life becoming more and more complex and sophisticated, somehow in some miraculous way, giving rise to life, to organic life, that in some profound, miraculous way, giving birth to consciousness and to the property of the soul. So perfectly fine mesoteric perspective. And here I'm going on a limb, you'd say. I'm going out to a point where some will leave the conversation or will laugh me out of the room by saying, for the esoteric perspective, there is nothing as preposterous and ludicrous as describing that way of seeing the emergence of life and consciousness. Notice, I didn't say that I am offended by this. I'm suggesting that's the esoteric perspective. I can hold the mesoteric and the esoteric perspective together. The esoteric perspective will say the complexification story of consciousness and the soul is the mesoteric unreadiness, unpreparedness to go through the reversal and to recognize that we are not flying here alone. And its insistence is its way to, it's hard work to smuggle indeed the physicalist, materialist view. But if you were to take it to a metaphoric term, you'd say, it's like this house I'm living in, the house you're living in, built itself. In practical sense, that this house, there's no way this house could have built itself. It needed 3 octaves to actually be developed. There had to be the structure, the building. We had to have the contractors, the builders that build the house, and they had to have a blueprint by which they build the house. I just went through exoteric, mesoteric, esoteric in another way. So to suggest that consciousness and the soul are properties that just emerged from the bottom up without some, even if very rarefied, luminescent form of a blueprint, like the house had a blueprint, inside of which the development of life and the development of the fantastical innovation of the neural structure and how the brain works, and all of that has a teleology that is guided by an intelligence of the blueprints of those innovations of life. And therefore, to also consider that the mind and consciousness are merely a product of the brain and are anchored in the brain is, again, for the esoteric perspective, would be ludicrous. And it will even insist that what we are describing is beyond, Layman, beyond just more or very rarefied energetic form. No, it would insist that we've got to even integrate realms and substrates that where we must consider this idea of a reversal, where there is a possibility that the physical form that we each are in does have a planetary due date to complete its duty, and that there is an energetic form, or actually more than one energetic form, various forms or bodies that would last this physical form, and depending on their level of refinement and development, they have continuance beyond that physical incidence. So this is very important when we deal with the crisis in the world, because we have some of the most powerful people in the world are sitting in Silicon Valley with billions of dollars, and they're running an experiment to upload the consciousness into the cloud in the hope to gain immortality, not realizing that, hey, first of all, would you consider that perhaps you already have immortality in what you have created, number one? And number two, could it be that you have some immortal property about you that needs its liberated continuance beyond the incidence of the egoic experience you are associating with this physical body, which is part of the problem we are facing with when you come back to the exoteric realm of, so how do we manage life and the changing of the epochs, and what do I have to say about the fact that so much has been lost from esoteric traditions, as you asked earlier. You know, in each tradition, in each esoteric traditions, there is a belief about those courageous leading souls and how they reappeared for next generation. In the Jewish tradition, there are many, many renowned rabbis that were murdered in the Holocaust. And there is, in some esoteric streams in Judaism, there is the belief that they reincarnated, that they found a way to instantiate themselves in a new cycle of life. Again, the classic, most obvious example is, of course, this beautiful Dalai Lama we enjoy the presence of, is, I believe, if I remember right, the 14th incarnation. Now, you can argue whether it actually is the soul of that same person incarnating, or whether they found a very bright soul and they've been able to train that soul to be in the collective wisdom of the generation that proceeded. It really matters not very much in terms of, you don't have to agree to the premise of that soul and whether it's actually the soul or whether it's another part of the interior forms and bodies that actually incarnate from life to life. I leave this aside because I think I've already skated a little bit outside of the mainstream appreciation of what the inquiries we're exploring. But I think that, Layman, is exactly why conversation like this, channel like the integral stage, and essentially the dozens and dozens of inquiries that are skating to the edge, each in their way, each through their inquiries, some more through the esoteric, some more through the tremendous care for the large ecosystem we call the planet and or Gaia, or whatever people associate with that dimension. That take-up needs many, many people on many, many frontiers.
I'm glancing at the time. I don't think we can finish even the second and third parts of the question I last asked. We probably needed to put 6 hours aside for this conversation, which I'm glad. That means there's a lot more future conversations for us. Let me just say what came up for me while you were going through that last part, which was the need to create cultural and intellectual spaces where these three domains interact with each other more richly, right? And one of those ways is just to gather people together who are good at moving fluidly through them. Right. You mentioned that you're not necessarily fixated in the esoteric position. You can hold and move these. And where groups of people come together who all have that skill, then an interesting blending begins to occur, which I think is very powerful in terms of starting to instantiate or further unfold the epoch that we're moving into. And at the intellectual level, I'm very fascinated by places where these different levels might cross-fertilize each other conceptually, right? Like it's very easy from the esoteric perspective to denigrate the notion of the transhumanist attempts at immortality, But what happens if we start to think of a future in which spiritual and transhumanist immortality are complementary in some way? Or, there's a lot of interesting philosophy that's been done in the world in the last 100 years. And people who are deeply anchored in practice lineages and in the phenomenology of transformation and in these sort of agency of spirit comes first models, often are confused as to why we would even be interested in these complicated mental schemes that might suggest evolutionary production of the qualities that they're presuming must come first in the ontology. But I can see I'm in conversations with people where they're extraordinarily complex, beautiful ways to start to weave those together, where we, conceptually unlearn some of the differences that we hold between esoteric and mesoteric definitions of things. And I just present that as one example of a kind of philosophy building effort that goes on in tandem with the communities that can circulate between these perspectives and consists of ways that the values and principles of each of those can be transported into the others in ways that might enrich them and also make them stranger and more nuanced than the ways these things have been articulated in the past. And that will clearly not be for everyone because it requires a lot of time and cognitive nuance to do things like that. But I feel very passionately aligned with both of those projects, the intellectual convergence of those domains and the cultural production of spaces for people who can circulate between those and produce a kind of socially benevolent ethos out of the things that those people find in common and produce together.
It's a huge, big conversation, or again, multiple conversations, because when you talk about the transhuman line of development, and so there again, we need to look at, we need to look at first, what are the different streams or lines within that? And are we talking about a techno-utopian perspective that proposes that those beings will actually replace humans because we humans are flawed and we want to create something that will transcend all our flaws? At which point I will challenge us to, before we further that conversation, to take a step or two steps back and engage with another preparatory conversation, which is to ask, what are the principles? What are the first principles? And I use this term in a slightly different context from how it has been popularized, but what are the principles by which, with which we will actually enter this conversation? And then we will look at that again through the exoteric, mesoteric, and the esoteric lens. And we will ask, well, what is the spirit and the soul perspective here? Are we talking about surrendering the agentic human experience to something other than us humans, or are we talking about exploring ways to bring technologies that will perhaps augment the human capacity? And if yes, how will we measure, how will we evaluate those technologies? How will we know that they are not detrimental to the human spirit? What would be the way to measure that? How will we? It's like, Layman, life never happens truly in A/B testing. Like, we didn't have another human race to test smartphones and social media on, where we can have younger generation testing in the A test, in the B test, we're testing without it, so we can see how the formation of the human brain has actually changed because of all these devices. So I would say the whole area that we didn't really get to begin to open And I don't know if it seems to me we're probably approaching landing here. So let me just say this. There is a whole area that we didn't get to open about the Universalis inquiry, to do with values, to do with the core premises of the Universalis development and evolution, where we would be asking these questions, having created a larger platform, rather than assuming that we can just rush on with all that the humanity is not doing. Because I think right now part of the what you saw there at the lower right of the landscape, when I talked about fallacies and perils, we're now in that zone. What are the dangers that we blow up this experiment before we actually facilitate and liberate the true Universalis potential? So I'm more holding back than rushing forward, because there is so much more to develop, and I also feel that we're not quite in a landing place so I'm looking inside me, where is the landing place for this first visit with the Universalis Project?
Yeah, I'm very excited to get to the sort of signs and facets of the Universalis emerging that you had at the bottom of that first slide, including the perils. I think in our ever-growing list of conversations we need to have, one of them needs to be around the core principles and premises, and especially the core principles of evaluation that will be implied in trying to do a safe and healthy epochal transition. Again, I would like to have the kibbutz conversation. And another thing that came up for me a lot that hasn't been in this conversation very much is the Gaia or biosphere aspect. And right, we're talking about a species that exists embedded within a complex living system. And, what role does it play in that system? What role does that system play in unfolding these epochs? How does the biosphere assist or even help evaluate and regulate the technological and philosophical and cultural transitions that we're going through? So the question of the living system, and the question of the social experiment of the kibbutz, and the question of these first principles, those are all on my mind as fertile next elements of conversation.
Wonderful. We're going to have to stay alive for many more years, because you just listed 20 more conversations we need to have. Perhaps a place to leave this conversation is in this sense that the invitation we are making with the threefold exoteric, mesoteric, esoteric framing is truly the foundational invitation into a multi-perspectival way of seeing the world, where the practice is you don't have to agree with anything I say. You don't have to believe any of it. The practice is, can you take the lens of what would it look like if that was true? And can you come along for the ride? Can you embrace a way of attempting to look at the world through esoteric eyes, and actually release the insatiable need to agree or disagree? It's one of the notations I've had with me over the last few days, centered on this idea that one of the pathologies, the cultural pathologies of the postmodern wave and how it played out, well, actually both modern and postmodern, is that the two displacements. The first displacement in that everybody wants to, I want to be me, I want to be me. There is a kind of insatiable desire in people, especially with younger generations, to be me. And then there is a coupling of that with, I want to be the singular, authentic me that I can be. Layman, I don't want to be me. I recognize that the me of me is a larger we, that there are many lives inside me, and that at different times I will live into these different parts and different lives, and they will have feelings that will conflict with others. This, which in past generation would send you to the psychiatric award on the sixth floor, is now we are appreciating part of the phenomenology of human life and is the central element of the Universalis arising. Because the Universalis arising and where the epochal journey would become important is in appreciating how, just reading this, because it was in me in coming to today, that the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the capacity to see things from an objective place and embrace an objective point of view, all of that these were initiatory stages for us to actually give birth to the capacity to embrace multi-perspectival experiences. Because really there we begin universal life. To begin universal life is to recognize that I am not just a one authentic voice. I am many. I am the many in one. And when I give permission to the many in one in me, I give permission to the human cause, to the human experience. And there I begin to metabolize the larger universal potential and the larger universal permission. So by giving birth to the interior multiplicity that I am on the inside, I begin to give rise to the through me and in the interpersonal space to the multiplicity that the universe itself is discovering its interior birthing, which it is able to access through us. So that's really a bit more of the feeling and also the fiduciary responsibility that we have, each one of us, by being human. This is why I ultimately say that we humans, we are called at this time to rediscover, reappreciate what being human means. So that maybe is a better place as a seeding for our next exploration.
Well, unfortunately, that's a uniquely Aviv thing to say. Uh, Part of me appreciates the paradoxes of the individual, where even the way that the individual speaks to the transpersonal has their own unique flavor in it. Another part of me feels this conversation very much as an example of something like the emerging universalis, as a singular and a plural, talking to itself through us, bringing itself into the world. And I think you're quite right, as are many of the people in the circles we travel in thinking that a culture, and I think particularly an education system that foregrounds the practice of multi-perspectival capacity is an essential element of this. I mean, these are great conversations. It's wonderful to go so deep and still feel like we're just at the beginning. And I look forward to the next rounds. Always happy to see you, Aviv.
Thank you. Thank you, Layman.